Colin, thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Kathy, who I've gotten to work with a tiny bit over the years, and I were agreeing that we were both a tiny bit intimidated to be here in the company of all the Rhodes scholars. In my case, for good reason, since I've lived with one for 30 years now, and she's the smartest person that I know, and I know the rest of you are smart too, because she, for years, has been on one of the committees that picks new Rhodes scholars, and so every year in the fall, the dining room table would get weighed down with hundreds of folders of this sort of, all of them, as far as I didn't really look at them, but all of them kind of brilliant, and so you're somehow the cream that has risen to the top of the cream, you know, and it's impressive to be in your company, and I'm grateful for the invitation. And frankly, it's not the Americans at the moment are kind of looking for excuses to get out of the country, even for a short period of time. It's a kind of depressing and demoralizing moment to be an American. So to be here on Earth Day is actually good, and because it allows one to think about one of the really best chapters in American history. It was this day in 1970, on the first Earth Day, that about 20 million Americans, the historians think, or 10% of the then population of the United States, rallied to demand action on things environmental. Without any doubt, the biggest day of demonstration like that in American history, and one of the largest in the history of the planet. And one that proved the efficacy of that kind of politics. In the next 4 or 5 years, because of the enormous wave of public sentiment that was in the streets, all the important pieces of legislation that governed America's environmental improvement and that were copied by countries around the world, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, were all signed in the wake of that, and signed by Richard Nixon, a man who had not the slightest interest in the environment at all, and would not on his own have taken the slightest action, but had no choice because he was pushed and pushed hard by a large community of people demanding action. And that's where I'm going to get back to at the end of this little talk, that need for a large community of people to demand things. Let's talk about the first thing that one has to talk about when one talks about climate change is the science. I wrote, as Colin said, the first book about all this back in the late 1980s. And at the time, we didn't know quite how fast and quite how hard this was going to pinch. We knew what was coming, but we didn't know quite when. The story of the last 30 years is it pinched a lot harder and a lot faster than scientists, who usually are quite conservative in their estimations, would have predicted. And we're now at the point, circa 2017, of real desperation. The last 3 years has smashed the records for global temperature. Every indicator that we have on this Earth is flashing red right now as fast and as brightly as it's possible to. If we look at the numbers for global sea ice, month after month now we're setting new record minimums. If we look at look at things like the largest living structure on the Earth, the Great Barrier Reef, decimated in the course of the last 2 years of coral bleaching in the Pacific. The way that water moves around the planet, the Earth's hydrological cycles, are now in a state of kind of permanent defibrillation, alternating between record drought and record flood in place after place after place, and it's beginning to do just unbelievable damage on a human scale. The story on the front page of the Times 2 weeks ago said that the drought now spreading out from Somalia may be the biggest humanitarian disaster since the end of World War II, and it linked it quite directly to human-caused changes in the climate. Every day's news feed now brings stories of floods here, droughts there, storms here, all of them unprecedented, and all of them deep harbingers of the future. We're no longer talking about a problem that will happen someday. We're talking about a crisis that we're now in the midst of, and we're no longer talking, stopping global warming is no longer one of the options on the table. We're now talking about trying to stop it short of the point where it overwhelms our ability to have civilizations, and there is no guarantee at this point that we can do that. If we have a window, it is a narrow window, and it is closing fast, and it is already closing on people, most of them poor and vulnerable. It's worth remembering all the time the kind of iron law of climate change, which it's the people who did the least to cause this problem suffer first and hardest from it. And that will continue all the way through. Wealth will always be some kind of refuge, although more and more and more, it's everyone and every place that is swept up in this work, in this crisis. So the reason that I'm taking a minute to stress this is that knowing the scope, the scale, and the pace of the problem is necessary to figuring out what the proper scale and pace of the solutions are, okay? So if it was a more gradual or less enormous problem, then there'd be a whole suite of things that it would make sense to talk about, but they make a lot less sense to talk about given the timing and the size of the emergency that we're in. So for instance, we are past the point where individual actions are the things that can alter this math. Our house is covered with solar panels. I plug my car into the solar panel. You know, these things are very important. There's no excuse not to try and change your life, but we try not to fool ourselves, Sue and I, that that's how global warming is going to be stopped, because it isn't at this point. You cannot make the math work one household at a time, one person at a time. Instead, we need large-scale changes, big policy changes. But that's the second thing I want to say, because rightly so, there'll be a lot of talk this weekend about policy and all the things, and we've already heard a good deal of it today. And it's all important, but it's also stuff that we've known about now for 30 years. None of it's, there's no like brilliant new policy ideas. We've known for decades that there should be a significant price on carbon. We've known an awful lot about all the other policy steps that people have been talking about, and that we talked about in Paris, and that we will talk about in the COPs ongoing into the future, and so on. All of that is crucial, but none of it will come because we keep having conferences about policy, okay? It will only come if we figure out how to build the political will to make it happen. Another way of saying this is, I'm trying to give you the benefit of my mistakes. I wasted the first 15 years of my work on this topic thinking that we were engaged in an argument about climate change. I'm a writer, a sort of academic, so for me, the logical step to take in any situation is to write another book about it, okay? Have another symposium, have some more journal articles. And that, in a rational world, would be precisely what one should do. I mean, our guess was that if we kept piling up information about the most dangerous problem that the world had ever faced, that eventually governments and things would swing into action and we'd begin to see real efforts to address this problem. But that didn't happen. The argument was won by the mid-1990s. There was no longer past that point any scientific doubt about the basic outlines of what was going on, though there remains endless amounts of good and interesting science for people to do. It wasn't, it turned out, an argument that we were having at all. We'd won the argument. What we were really having was a fight. And the fight, as fights always are, was about money and power, and there was an adversary in this fight. And that adversary was and is the richest industry in the history of the world, the fossil fuel industry. And they were willing to do what it took to preserve their business model, even at the cost of breaking the planet. That sounds hyperbolic, but 2 years ago or so, great reporters at the LA Times, Columbia Journalism School, elsewhere, began doing a sort of ongoing and powerful expose of some of those companies, most importantly Exxon, the biggest oil company, indeed for most of the last 50 years, the biggest company on earth, a company that year after year made more money than any company in the history of money, okay? Because they had great resources, because they had great scientists, and because their product was carbon, they studied it carefully. And by the late 1970s, the documents uncovered in these exposés made clear, documents, by the way, that the Attorney General of New York and Massachusetts are now investigating in a probe of the company. Those documents made entirely clear that their scientists had understood what was going to happen. They gave quite specific warnings to their senior management about how much the temperature was going to go up and when, predictions that turned out to be more or less spot on. Their senior management believed them. They used those to guide their bidding on new oil leases in the Arctic that they knew would melt. They used it to prepare. They started building their drilling rigs to accommodate the sea level rise that they knew was coming. Okay? What they didn't do was tell any of the rest of us. Instead, they and their colleagues in the industry spent tens, hundreds of millions of dollars building an architecture of deceit and denial and disinformation, often using the same people who had done the same job a generation before for the tobacco industry. And as a result, we've so far wasted a quarter century in a completely sterile debate about the reality of global warming, one that both sides, it turned out, knew the answer to 30 years ago, okay? That fight continues. It continues in the most dramatic form right now in the US, where the fossil fuel industry has won an enormous victory in the last election, managed to install the CEO of Exxon in the Secretary of State's job, the second most important job in the country, put a man who is essentially wholly owned by the fossil fuel industry into the head of the EPA, which he is now systematically dismantling. That fight continues all over the world in place after place. And I hesitate to use this kind of martial language about fights and things because I know that you all are peaceable and wise people. But you were, after all, instructed, yes, to fight the world's fight. Is that right, Sue? And this is the world's fight at the moment. This is, for our time, the great fight that there is. It's too easy to talk about Trump and as the kind of representative of all that's wrong, as if his accession to power had somehow interrupted what was otherwise a charmed procession towards solving this problem. It isn't so. Take, for example, and I just was writing about this last week, so the numbers are fresh in my mind, take Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, who would be the kind of model of the sort of leader that many of us would like. He's not only handsome as can be, he's liberal in many, many ways, and inclusive and diverse, and says all the right things all the time. In fact, the reason that we're having this Generation 1.5 meeting is, in part, it's due to Kathy and her colleagues on the island nations who pushed hard for that target. And one of the countries, maybe the most important country in a certain way in intervening in the talks to make sure that that 1.5 target got in the Paris Treaty, was Canada. They pushed very hard, citing the work of island nations. So good for them. Except that 2 weeks ago, Justin Trudeau, talking to the oil conference in Houston, the annual big oil conference, gave a speech in which he talked about the tar sands of Alberta. And he said, and I quote, "No country could be expected to find 173 billion barrels of oil and leave it in the ground." Okay? So let's think about that for a minute. We know how much carbon budget we have to give us any hope of staying below 1.5 degrees, all right? If we burned that 173 billion barrels of oil, that's the recoverable, easily recoverable stuff up in the tar sands of Canada, that 173 billion barrels uses up about 30% of the remaining carbon budget that gets us to 1.5 degrees, i.e. a country with 0.5% of the world's population would like to lay claim to 30% of the atmosphere in order to further enrich itself, all right? Canada is not alone in this. Australia is doing precisely the same thing as they struggle to build the largest coal mine in the world, one that has the support of all the major political parties in Australia. The United States is the biggest, perhaps, example of this under Barack Obama, in whose tenure the United States passed Saudi Arabia and Russia as the largest supplier of hydrocarbons on the planet, drilling and mining everywhere that pretty much anyone wanted to. So my point is that we're nowhere near where we need to be, and as nice as the Paris Agreement was, even had we honored the pledges in it, we would have increased the temperature of the planet about 3.5 degrees Celsius or so. And the hope, as people said this morning, is that somehow the Paris Accords would allow us to sort of increase our ambition and do all kinds of things and become a kind of virtuous cycle. But instead, there is also a sense in which it became a kind of greenwashing exercise too, allowing leaders like Trudeau or whatever to say beautiful things on the one hand and do things that are not beautiful on the other hand. And so in a situation where the normal channels are failing, okay, where politics as usual, even liberal politics as usual, is not producing the outcome that we obviously require, since we can't let the temperature of the planet go up 1.5, 2, 2.5, 3 degrees. If we do, we can't have civilizations like the ones we're used to, okay? In those situations, the question becomes what to do. What other factor can we bring on board? And the answer to that is that in those reasonably rare circumstances where change like that is required, what you need is some currency to compete with the enormous wealth of the other side. The currency in this case has got to be the currency of movements. Passion, spirit, creativity, the willingness sometimes to spend one's body, okay? That's what history indicates happens, is the thing that changes those situations that are going in the wrong way. It's not for nothing that this Rhodes House is now mostly filled with, as far as I can tell, pictures and busts of Nelson Mandela, okay? He was a perfect example of that kind of understanding. So I'm going to talk for just a minute about the work we've done to kind of start trying to build a climate movement where there wasn't one. 10 years ago, there really wasn't much of a climate movement. There were just experts going to conferences, having the same discussions, and not getting very far precisely because there was very little political will. And sometimes those conferences failed completely, as in Copenhagen in 2009, when the world's leaders got together and literally nothing happened, okay? And that was one of the moments that kind of woke us up. When I say we, in this case, we started 350.org with myself and 7 undergraduates, so people a year or two younger than you, at Middlebury College, where Sue and I hang out some in Vermont. And we had no idea what we were doing, so don't take any of this that I'm saying as particularly gospel. I'm a writer. I'm not an activist by trade. We've been making it up as we go along. But our theory was that we needed some kind of movement to counterbalance the power of the fossil fuel industry and put real pressure on governments, that we needed some way to get this debate unstuck. And that's what we started trying to do. We had no money when we started. We had no list. We had no organization. We didn't know really what to do. We took our name from what scientists sort of was the most important number in the world, but no one knew it until about 2008 when Jim Hansen, the greatest climate scientist that the world has yet had, he and his team at NASA published a paper saying the most carbon you could safely have in the atmosphere was 350 parts per million CO2. Any value above that, he said, was, in the abstract of the paper, not compatible with the planet on which civilization developed or to which life on Earth is adapted, okay? That's strong language for scientists to use. Stronger still when you know that we're well north of 350 parts per million. We crossed 400 about 18 months ago, right? Something like that, and we're going up pretty close on 3 parts per million per year at this point. In fact, I think just last week we crossed 410 for the first time momentarily. It will go back down as the seasons progress, but we're headed just on a straight upward escalator. It was a depressing paper that Hansen wrote, but useful for our purposes in a way because it gave us a name. If we wanted to organize around the world, we figured the biggest problem that we faced, we didn't stop to think about all the other problems that we faced. We figured the big problem would be everybody around the world insists on speaking their own language. So how are we going to communicate? Numbers will work well. Arabic numerals translate. So that's why we became 350.org. There were 7 undergraduates. There are 7 continents. Each one took one. The guy who took the Antarctic also took the internet, okay? And we set out. And our job was to find people like ourselves around the world, and so we went to work. And I'm just, well, I mean, I'm going to flip through just very, very quickly, not even talk about it. We think we've organized so far about 20,000 demonstrations around the world in every country except North Korea. And these are just a few of my favorite shots from around the world of just endless numbers of, that's Jordan, Israel, Palestine. That's the Student Government Association of the Maldives meeting in the lagoon to demonstrate the same existential crisis that's afflicting the islands of the Pacific that Kathy was talking about. These are from a file marked 350 adorable. But we've done a zillion of these things in every part of the world that you can name, and they've been beautiful and wonderful. And if we had 50 years, this is just what we would keep doing, because this is the best way. You know, education and gradual change is precisely how humans and human societies work best. It would be the proper way to do things. Our problem is we don't have 50 years. We had to start 25 years ago, and we didn't. That, for those of you with a good classical education, that's Tom York got 3,000, you can barely see it on this, but the 3,000 people in blue raincoats who are forming the image of King Canute as he tries to hold back the rising oceans at Brighton Beach. That scarab beetle is pushing solar panels across the Egyptian desert. That's one of those dry riverbeds in Santa Fe that don't flow anymore, but when the satellite came over, 3,000 people put blue blankets up overhead for a second just to bring the river back to life for a moment. So we've done, as I say, we'd like to do this on and on and on, but time does not allow that gradual, orderly transition. We're in an emergency, an urgent situation, really one that has no particular parallel in human history, and where we have to move with incredible speed. So, along with education, we've gone in recent years for confrontation too, and tried to up the pace at which things are happening. And these are a couple of slides from the beginning of the fight against the Keystone Pipeline. Now almost 6 years ago, in the States, this pipeline down from the tar sands in Alberta. And nobody thought that there was any chance that we could possibly block it. All the experts in Washington, they polled them at the National Journal, the insider newspaper in DC, and 93% of them said that TransCanada would have its permit by the end of 2011. the company that wanted to build it, because they always had won. Everything the oil industry ever wanted to build had been built over the years. But people went to jail in record numbers, more people than had gone to jail about anything in this country in 30 years. And then it started spreading around the world. Ben, that's for you. And then, just on and on and on. It was good. President Obama, after a few months of this relentless pressure, said, let's hold off on a decision on this thing until after the next election. And then he said, let's hold off until after the next election after that, the midterms in 2014. And then he finally said, okay, we're not going to build this. Now, Donald Trump's eager to build it, and so it may eventually get built, although there's going to be a hell of a fight out on the plains of Nebraska and South Dakota and Montana before it gets built. We shall see. But by the way, Justin Trudeau, too, is really big on building this one also, so, there you are. The thing that was useful about it was precisely that it helped other people understand what they could do. And now, every single pipeline pretty much on the planet, in any place that isn't a completely autocratic and authoritarian country, gets fought and fought hard. Every frac well, every new LNG port, every piece of fossil fuel infrastructure that might extend out the fossil fuel age another 40 years once it gets built, all of them now get fought. The head of the American Petroleum Institute said in a speech to his colleagues last year, he said, we somehow have to figure out a way to stop the Keystoneization of everything that we're doing. Confess that my dark heart soared a little bit when I heard him say that. But these guys never give up. This is the Heartland Institute, one of the groups that Exxon helped form in the 1990s, a front group that started putting up billboards a few years ago around America they're like baseball cards, but of serial killers. They had one for Charles Manson and so on. And they all had the same thing. I believe in global warming. Do you? Not a very logical, it's like putting up a poster of Hitler and say, I believe in gravity, do you? But emotionally, the point was to make clear that climate scientists were somehow equivalent to serial killers, that they were going to come and do bad things to you. And so we were glad, that we were doing demonstrations. It turned out the same weekend that they started putting those up, we did this thing called Connect the Dots around the world. It had just happened to be scheduled. It had people rallying everywhere to try and show that they were already being hit by climate change. So there they were, underwater on coral reefs, or in those parts of Africa. This is the part of Africa where drought has basically made pastoralism all but impossible in recent times. And one of the results has been that it's a hotbed of Boko Haram and other kind of trouble. Not everywhere is the trouble quite as extreme, but it's worth noting that it would be sad at northern latitudes that winter would kind of disappear. That 3-month interregnum when friction disappears from the planet. If it's replaced now instead with the kind of season of cold mud, that will make at least some of us mad. These people are in the parts of Siberia where we now have forest fires routinely, 3, 4, 5 degrees latitude north of where we've ever had them before, because it's too hot and too dry. There's Micronesia where people are leaving, okay? These guys are in the district in Pakistan that had the biggest flood since Noah in 2010. Warm air holds more water vapor than cold. If you want one fact to understand the 21st century, that might be it. So we get more drought and more evaporation, but then when it comes down, it really comes down. The Indus River spread to the point where it covered 25% of Pakistan. 20 million people were out of their homes. If you look at them, you can get a pretty good guess that they were not major causes of the crisis in which they now find themselves enmeshed. Same thing, literally I could show you these pictures day and night till the end of time. This one always struck me, even more now, but it always struck me because of the sign that those kids were holding in this little tiny gathering in southwest Haiti. It says, your actions affect me, which is true. In fact, they didn't know how true it would turn out to be. Last year, a hurricane going across record warm water, record temperatures in the Caribbean, smashed into that part of Haiti about 2 years after this picture was taken and obliterated that town of Lake Hay. At least 80% of the buildings were destroyed or wrecked in the course of that hurricane. I have no idea if those kids are alive anymore or not, but their sentiment was absolutely right. Your actions affect me. The trouble is not vice versa. There's not a huge amount that they can do to stem this problem because they're not going to burn less fossil fuel. They're not burning any now. They're not going to, march on Washington because we don't let people from Haiti come to Washington. They're not going to divest their holdings in fossil fuel company stocks and bonds because, well, I don't know the exact financial situation, but my guess is the Rhodes Trust has more money in its endowment than all the investment capital on the island of Haiti, okay? So your actions affect me, but not so much vice versa. But boy, are they fighting. They're in fact leading the fight. And the fight, as you can tell from looking at these pictures, the environmental movement is not wealthy white people in the West. It's mostly poor, black, brown, young Asian people because that's what the world is mostly made up of, okay? And that's who's doing much of the fighting. But happily, there's fighting going on all over the place, confrontation is now more and more the order. These are the guys in Portland. I have another better picture maybe a little bit later on, but those are the guys in Portland who blocked the giant drilling rigs in Portland and Seattle Harbor that were going up the Shell rigs that wanted to go drill in the Arctic for oil last year or the year before. Think about that for a minute. Shell oil, next time you want to kind of understand whether corporations have much innate responsibility or not, in social responsibility, think about what it means that a giant corporation, second biggest oil company in the world, watched the Arctic melt, okay, as scientists had told them it would. And instead of saying to themselves, well, perhaps this is a sign that we should radically diversify our business and start building solar panels or wind turbines, they looked at the melting Arctic and said, hey, that would make it easier to drill for yet more oil in the Arctic. Let's have at it. Think about the sickness that represents, okay? It was a good thing that those people who we started calling kayaktivists were able to give them a lot of trouble. After a summer of it, Shell decided that it wasn't worth the brand damage that they were going to suffer. And so they are no longer attempting to drill in the Arctic. These are scenes from the vast People's Climate March in New York 3 years ago now. At the time, the biggest demonstration until the Women's Marches about anything in our country in a very long time. It was magnificent, and there'll be another one for those of you who happen to be in the States next weekend. On the 29th, we're doing this again, this time in D.C., which will again be to mark the 100th day of the Trump reign. But powerful as those pictures are, I wanted to show these just because Kathy reminded me of them in her presentation. This was happening at exactly the same time, and to me was an even more beautiful story. On all these island nations in the Pacific that are in danger from rising seas, and also, it must be said, from the rapidly acidifying ocean that does a number on coral reefs as well. Don't think of coral reefs mostly as something to go scuba dive on your honeymoon, though that's a perfectly nice thing to do. Remember that they're the source of food for several hundred million people on the planet, and just as important, the protection from wave action surrounding island nations all over the world, okay? So people are in big trouble in countries like Tuvalu and Vanuatu and the Marshalls and Micronesia and the Solomons and wherever else. But as their slogan says, we are not drowning, we are fighting. And the way that they chose to fight in this nonviolent war that summer was on each of these islands to take down a tree which is, on some of them is a big deal. There aren't that many big trees there. Take them down and build a traditional canoe, okay? And then they use the canoes to blockade the largest coal port in the world in Newcastle, Australia. I think that Kathy might have shown you this picture in her presentation. It stuck in my mind too, all these pictures did, because they're the perfect iconography of this battle. It is a battle between the many and the small against the big and the very few, okay? And it is a titanic fight that's underway. And it's one that we need people engaged in. We don't, it's not the question, I mean, what you do with your careers is really important and interesting and so on and so forth, but we need you at night and on weekends doing the actual work of citizenship that from time to time human beings have to engage in. And in this case, it means this kind of movement building to put serious pressure on a system that is not responding anywhere near fast enough to the threats that we face. I know that there's lots of, I've enjoyed just in the few hours that we've been here wandering around the halls because I keep seeing pictures of friends of mine who I guess were Rhodes Scholars and who are great fighters. Ben Jealous, the former head of the NAACP in the States, who's been a huge climate warrior. Kumi Naidoo from South Africa, who's on the board of 350 and ran Greenpeace, and you know. But the story I want to end by telling you is about one of my favorite people in America, because I think his story kind of illustrates. I mean, there's great climate fighters here like Tim Weiskell, who have been doing this for decade after decade and keeping the kind of argument, winning the argument year after year after year. But the guy I want to tell you about, I think was before you, Tim, even here as a Rhodes Scholar, Gus Speth, okay, who was in many ways the absolute paradigm of, I think, what you were sort of classically supposed to do with your Rhodes Scholarship, you know, go on and sort of run in the best possible way the elite establishments of our planet. He helped found NRDC, the activist group, but then went on to run the President's Council on Environmental Quality, the kind of inside the White House environmental leadership. Then he went on to run the entire United Nations Development Program, so predecessor to what Akim will be doing soon. And then he went on to be dean at Yale and run the forestry school, probably the greatest school of environmental management and study, at least in the United States, okay? Every possible important thing that you could have done, and always fighting the good fight, always in the best way. And at the end of it, as the climate crisis became clearer and clearer, wrote a book saying, you know what, none of this really worked. I was on the wrong tack here, because without the political will that we needed, none of this policy work was happening at a pace that made any difference. We're losing. When we started that Keystone fight, and there were those pictures of people, that's a really good picture from Newcastle that I really like. When we started that Keystone fight, one of the people that came and got arrested right at the beginning, very first day of the Keystone thing, was Gus Speth. It was, though he was already semi-retired, it was probably the end of his active career as a lawyer. That was his, you know, what he trained as, because you're not supposed to get arrested if you're a lawyer. But he decided it was worth it. Now, we didn't think when we got arrested that first day that we were probably going to spend much time in jail. Normally, they just release people who sit down in front of the White House. But apparently, they were trying to teach us a lesson, so we went off to spend 3 days, I guess, in Central Cell Block in D.C., which is as much fun as it sounds like it would be. But people were 2 to a cell through bars, and so in the cell next to mine was Gus, who at the time was in his mid-70s anyway. These are not ideal conditions. You're just kind of lying on a steel slab. There's a light on all the time. You know, they don't really feed you very much. It was pretty grim, okay? I mean, not the end of the world, but pretty grim. Especially if you're in your mid-70s and you've spent your life, you know, running the United Nations Development Program and being dean at Yale and so on and so forth. But he looked at me at one point. His son was actually a big lawyer at a big white shoe firm in DC. So he was the only one of us who was able to even get out to see a lawyer in the course of those 3 days. For a minute, they let him go out and see his son, shackled and things, but there he was. And so he knew that he'd be able to get the one message out to reporters that we'd be able to get out. And he was sort of wondering what it was he should say. And all he said, and it was a brilliant quote, I thought, and one that you guys might want to reflect on as you begin your illustrious careers. He said, told the reporters, he said, I've held a lot of important positions in my life, but none of them seem as important as the one I'm in right now, okay? That was a remarkable moment for me, thinking about, that he decided that that was the place that of all the things he'd done might have mattered the most. I'm not telling you all need to go to jail. That's not the point. I'm telling you the planet is way outside its comfort zone, and so all of us need to be outside our comfort zone at some way or another. And I'm telling you not to delude yourself into thinking, if you really care about this issue, that we're currently on a path that's getting us anywhere near where we need to go. Climate change, because of the pace and scale of this problem, and this is the thing I would underline and think about, with climate change, winning slowly is the same as losing, okay? Winning slowly is the same as losing. Dr. King always said, at the end of talks, he would say, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. This may take a while, but we're going to win. And that's, you know, that fight is still ongoing, but progress, you know, in fits and starts. The arc of the physical universe is short, and it bends toward heat. And if we do not win very quickly, then we do not win at all right? Then all we do is deal with the aftermath and try to figure out what happens in a world that's quickly coming apart. And that's going to be an almost impossible process. 5 years ago, the deepest drought that we have ever recorded descended on what we used to call the Fertile Crescent, particularly the part in Syria. And a couple of million farmers were driven off their land and into cities, and that was enough to finish the job of destabilizing what was already a brutal and weak regime. But the academic papers are very clear, the literature is clear that this was a decisive force in helping trigger that civil war in Syria, one that's now spawned refugees hither and yon, and as you well know, destabilized the politics not only of the Middle East, but now of Europe, okay? If that's what happens in one country with a couple of million people forced to change by drought, try to imagine what happens as this century goes on. This, just as 100 years ago, or no, 75 years ago, the fight of everybody's time was trying to contain fascism in Europe somehow, a fight that, after all, required lots of people who were, including lots of people who were Rhodes Scholars, to go and get killed in the course of it, you know. In our time, this is the fight on that scale. And it doesn't require anybody to go, we hope, get killed, and certainly not to go kill anybody, but it does require people to dig in. And that's all I really want to say. Happy Earth Day, you all. And I've talked on too long, as always, but I left a little time for questions and comments and critique. You can fire back at me because I fired at you.
Hi, Thank you so much for this talk. So you talked about how in the past few decades, you and your organization have organized 22,000 of these protests, and how in recent times you felt that there wasn't enough time to do this slowly, peacefully, democratically, and so it escalated to serve...
Peacefully, we still work on, yes, and democratically.
But it escalated to, it seems like, civil disobedience, getting arrested, sit-ins. I have two questions. I'm wondering, do you advocate for anything past that? And if you don't, as I'm going to guess you don't, do you think that realistically your goals can be accomplished without anything more than civil disobedience?
Well, first place is, it must be said, I don't know whether our goals, our joint goals, can be accomplished or not. I mean, it's not completely clear that we can still win this fight. We've waited a very long time to get started. When you've reached the point where the major physical features on your Earth are changing rapidly in real time, that's a bad sign, okay? So that said, there are good signs too, and we talked about them this morning. The group of people that really did their job well were the engineers. The fact that the price of a solar panel has fallen 80% is the one thing that gives us reason to think that we could make a very rapid transition. If we wanted to, we could do this, and we know this because there are places that have done it. I mean, Denmark generated half its power from the wind last year, either because the Danes figured out how to steal the world's wind supply for themselves, or because they have the political will to do what needs to be done, okay? So on the question of generating political will, do I think we should go beyond nonviolence? No, not only for moral reasons, which would be enough, but mostly because that would be the least effective possible method. Think about the situation we find ourselves in. We're up against the richest and most powerful companies on Earth and the governments that they in large measure control. Like at the moment, for instance, the American government. If you decided to engage in violent opposition to that government or most others, one of the features of governments is they have way more guns than anybody else, okay? Very unwise to choose battle on their terms, okay? As people like Mr. Mandela figured out over time, so we use other things. And my colleague Louise works hard on financially disarming these guys, this divestment movement. Britain just passed its 100th institution to divest from fossil fuel, for instance. But we also do things like civil disobedience because it's effective. When people write the history of the 20th century, at the moment, they would say that the most important inventions of the 20th century were, the double helix here at Oxford, or, nuclear fission, or something. But I think in 100 or 200 years, people will say that the most important invention of the 20th century may have been nonviolent strategies and techniques. Gandhi was, and above all, an inventor. I mean, that's what he was doing. He called his autobiography Experiments with Truth, and it was experiments that he was undertaking, and they were very successful. And in the American context, they were refined by people like Dr. King, but people have translated them, in a sense, into many different vernaculars. We don't understand everything that there is to understand about nonviolence, because there's not, every country has a West Point or a Sandhurst, but no country has a equivalent that's figuring out about nonviolence. But we're learning a lot as we go along, picking up a lot of ideas and a lot of learning. The learning curve's almost as steep as it is with solar panel engineers, okay? So this is our strength, and done right, it actually has some chance of working. No guarantee, as I said before, I don't think there are any guarantees in this thing.
Most powerful weapon, which is to say, your use of deliberate and intentional language has focused the need to rethink the fundamental metaphor. at the core of what industrial civilization is doing. We built the whole enterprise based on the notion that we're set apart from nature, whereas in fact you've suggested that the important realization is that we are a part of nature, that we're inserted within an ecosystem, not trying to conquer it in some sense. And in that sense, it's up to us to realize the power of the metaphorical change you've already accomplished. And I think we all owe you a great big debt.
Well, thank you, Tim. One could talk for a million years about all the different interesting philosophical parts of this, and I think you're getting at a very deep and important one. And I have a feeling that that conversation is actually going to be carried out in the course of the fight, not as a kind of preliminary to it where we reach a kind of new agreement about how we view the world or whatever. We'll do that as we go along. And one of the things to be said is that, that if we luck out and do the things right that we're supposed to do, in many ways, the world on the other end, though impoverished by climate change, and there's no getting around how deeply that's going to cut no matter what we do at this point, the world will be improved in other ways. Substituting the sun and the wind for oil and coal and gas is not just a victory in terms of carbon, it's also a big victory, I think, in terms of democracy and equality. I mean, at the moment, an incredible amount of political power and wealth accrues to people simply because they happen to have control of small concentrated deposits of carbon beneath the Earth's surface. In the American context, our biggest oil and gas barons are the Koch brothers. They're the largest leaseholders in Canada's tar sands. They've done more to distort, wreck, and uglify our politics than any other two people, you know. And the same is true all over the world. There's, with the exception of, as always, of Norway, there's almost not a place on the earth where big concentrations of fossil fuel didn't lead to big and ugly political problems as well. So the sun and the wind are diffuse but omnipresent. And if everybody is generating their power from what they have close to them, then one of the big sources, and really big sources of inequality in our economy and political system will be, at least to some degree, alleviated. And that'll be a nice step forward.
Hi, thanks so much for your talk. I was just wondering, a lot of what you've spoken about is activism in the context particularly of the energy sector, so protesting against pipelines, for example. And I was just wondering if you have any ideas about how people might also try to make change in other sectors such as aviation, agriculture, or other areas.
Yeah, that's a very good question, Beck. Probably the other one that really counts is agriculture. We think about, depending on how you count it, about 18% of emissions, something like that, are associated with agriculture, maybe a little bit more. So it's a big source. Someone was saying earlier today, the equivalent of transport. It's harder, but whoever, I'm now managing to forget who it was that was saying this earlier today, but it was a wise observation. I think it was our speaker at lunch, Forbes, who said, pointed out that one of the problems with agriculture is it's incredibly fragmented. You can actually, hard as it is to take down the fossil fuel industry, at least it's a manageable number of targets. Like, we have a list of the 200 companies that control 95% or something of the world's carbon reserves. It's possible to imagine pressuring them. There are literally 2.5 billion or something farmers on the planet. You know, it's by far the largest career that people have on our Earth. And that fragment makes it more difficult. The biggest problem with agriculture is industrialized agriculture, factory farming. That's where we get enormous emissions problems, because basically we've substituted oil for human labor and judgment. There's less than, in America, less than 1% of people farm. Okay, we have half as many farmers as prisoners in the United States, okay, which says something about both those sectors, actually, of our economy. But I think the quickest way, probably, to getting real change in agriculture probably runs through putting a serious price on carbon. It's entirely dependent on cheap fossil fuel to farm the way that we're farming at the moment. And a serious price on carbon that reflects the damage it's doing in the environment would probably have fairly quick effects on some of the ways that we conduct agriculture. There's other good things that are happening. In the run-up to Paris, the French government passed a law that called the 4% law or something that incentivizes farmers to try and increase by 0.4% each year for the next decade the amount of carbon in the soil. And there are ways to do that and it would help. The biggest problem is fossil fuel. All the other things are like ways of trying to chisel out a slightly larger drain in the bottom of the bathtub. But as long as you have the taps open full blast at the top of the tub, it's very difficult to really make much progress in lowering the level there. Good question. Martin.
Thank you to you and your wife for being with us this weekend. So you mentioned having a currency to fight back against the aggregated money on the right. And I was wondering your thoughts on some of the basically people like Tom Steyer that use super PAC money to combat the super PAC money on the right.
Say again?
That use super PAC money to fight against super PAC money on the right.
So I got to say, I don't spend a lot of time worrying about money in general, okay? The amount of money that it takes to run the kind of work that we do or environmental groups do is small enough that we can figure out how to raise it, you know? And I think that's where much of the real good work coming from. It's useful that there's the occasional billionaire, and Tom Steyer is a great example, who's just completely engaged in this fight. But we don't need a whole ton of them, actually. Money is, we're beginning to learn some different things about money. One of the things that people were talking about, I think, again, it was Forbes in his excellent and provocative and understated presentation at lunch. One of the things he was talking about was the possibilities that these new platforms offered. Well, one of the things that they offer clearly is the ability to raise small dollar amounts of money from enough people across enough places to be competitive. We don't have to have as much money as Exxon because they don't have anywhere near as many people as we have, okay? If we go out and get 100,000 people out in the street rallying against the Keystone Pipeline, there's not a rally the next day with 100,000 people in favor of it, okay? They don't have. What they have is money, and it's right and proper to be completely depressed about the American political scene right at the moment because somehow we ended up with a creepy pervert running our country and it's going to be a disastrous 4 years and so on and so forth. But we were not that far away from having Bernie Sanders run America. And the way that he came that close to doing it was like $27 at a time from hundreds of thousands of people around the country. So that's a little bit of money goes a long way. We need people's hearts, minds, and bodies. Someone said, maybe me, a few weeks ago, that for the foreseeable future in America, weekends are for fighting fascism, and that's exactly right. We need people out marching, doing everything. I think I saw in the back there. And down here too, I think.
Hi, thank you so much for your remarks. I'm Robin Rotman from the class of 2004, and I wanted to push back a little bit on this notion because it seems like on one hand you're emphasizing how much wealth there is supporting the fossil fuel industry, and then at the same time saying we don't need wealth to combat that.
Don't what?
The money isn't what we need to combat that. And I was hearing a lecture by Gus Speth just last week where what he was suggesting actually was to raise as much money as possible to try to buy out the fossil industry on the notion that companies don't act against their interests, people don't often act against their personal financial interest. And so
So that might be an interesting tactic. If you had all the money in the world and you could buy out Exxon and shut them down, that maybe we could do it. I don't know. And if Gus has got something going, then we'll send some money.
Well, how do you use these types of gatherings that you've showed us, or that we've seen on the rise recently, as a force, as a catalyst that's productive, and not to get those who are participating to think, okay, well, I showed up, I took a picture in the canoe. That is meant to be a catalyst for further involvement, and not a replacement for it. And I think sometimes those can be conflated. What have you done to make sure that these have a lasting impact?
We actually haven't found that. We found that one of the things we discovered early on that was interesting, and I suspected it might be true and it turned out to be true, was that it was better to ask people to do hard things, not easy ones. That asking people to change their light bulbs or whatever turned out to have just the effect that people did it, and as they did it, they thought, okay, this clearly is not doing anything. Global warming is still going to happen, okay? And therefore they walked away. In fact, the big problem with climate change is it's so big, and we all seem so small next to it that it's very hard to imagine that we have any individual agency to deal with it. And indeed, we don't have any individual agency to deal with it. Yes, everyone should ride the bike, and everyone should change the light bulb and all those things. But the most important thing individuals can do is not be quite so much individuals. The point is that we need to join together. So one of the reasons that we started doing all these things years ago was precisely in order to show everybody that there were enough other people around the world who were engaged in this fight, that there was a plausible strategy here, a plausible way to affect change. And to a large degree, these things have some effect. That huge climate march in New York, which was during the UN Climate Week, was, most observers now say, was one of the reasons that Paris was a lot more successful than, in fact, the UN had kind of by back channel sort of suggested that something like that would be a good idea, perhaps someone could do it, so on and so forth. It was the first time that the Secretary General of the UN, any Secretary General of the UN, had ever come and marched in any kind of demonstration of any kind. So that kind of work is, it's not the, don't make the mistake of saying that, of thinking that I'm saying that substitutes for doing the work of policy or whatever else. It doesn't. It's a different kind of work, but the policy stuff is there. We know what it is we need to do. We just have to build the pressure to make it actually get done at this point.
Hi, my name is Brian, and yeah, so as you approach activism, I noticed that you are very concerned with tackling kind of the big, the parts of the big parts of the makeup of kind of carbon emissions. So I imagine for your team that's very important. And then I saw you also had an article about global warming's terrifying new math. I haven't looked at it yet, but I guess as an organization and with many kind of people who are involved in activism, how important is it for you to kind of communicate that scientific literacy and a mathematical literacy part of that? What are the main points you communicate, and or do you think it's just more important that kind of people show up? Or
We're huge believers in a couple of things. One of them is art, for all the reasons that Kathy was describing in her really, really great workshop. And that's one of the things that we've prioritized since we started at 350.org. Big involvement with artists and musicians, and just every effort to try and reach the hemisphere of the brain that isn't moved by bar graphs and pie charts, okay? Because that's what environmentalists tend to be good at. But the other half is a deep commitment to scientific literacy. That's why we picked a scientific data point as our name, that and the fact that it translated across borders. People said, oh, it's much too depressing. It's too complicated and it's too depressing because we're already past it. You shouldn't do that. And our thinking was twofold. One, it's not that complicated. People are much smarter than people give them credit for. You don't have to understand everything about the carbon cycle, but people understand the concept of too much, okay? Here's 350 is how much you can have, and we have more of it, so, and likewise, yes, it's depressing, but it's depressing in the same way that when you go to the doctor, I mean, if you go to the doctor and the doctor says, oh, if you keep eating like this, someday your cholesterol will be too high and you'll have a heart attack, then you do nothing, okay? You just go on doing what you're doing. When you go to the doctor and the doctor says, your cholesterol is already in the zone where people have heart attacks, and in fact, I think you had a small stroke, a month ago looking at your heart, then you say, what pill do I take, for get me to the sneaker store, I'm ready to make some changes. And we found both those things to be very true with 350. I mean, you saw pictures from all over the world with people doing what's pretty advanced science education in their communities, 350 parts per million CO2. One of the other reasons that we picked it is because I'm a journalist, and so I knew that every time a newspaper or a TV station took a picture of one of those demonstrations where people were spelling out 350, that the demands of journalism would mean they would have to explain what this number meant and what it meant, and it would have to go through the whole rigmarole just to get it across. And so it was a constant means of education. So that's a very good question. I'm told that we are out of time. Thank you all enormously.
Thank you, Bill. What a fantastic session, and what a great non-conclusion, because the day and the evening continues, but what a great conclusion, at least, to the sessions in here. I just wanted to sum up, to some degree, the day's proceedings with three quick themes, and then we can move into the latter part of the day's proceedings. But the first one is leadership. And we are here because we are here to fight the world's fight. This is clearly one of the world's fights, and we just heard that fighting that fight may well mean going to jail. And I think it's important to just be cognizant of how significant the fight is. And we've heard that today, not just from Bill, but from Achim, from Kathy, and from Forbes, great exemplars of leadership in this area. And the scale of the challenge that we have in front of us requires it. And what I'd like you to challenge yourselves with, don't just come along and learn a bit about climate change and go away and think, well, that was a good course here. But what are you going to do on this front? And we've had these inspiring examples. And the thing is that while it does seem like it's a problem that's too big for any one person, we live in an age where, whether it's platforms, whether it's inspiring examples that can motivate others, we can scale our efforts and provide the kind of leadership that can lead to substantial change, especially if you're sitting in a seat in this room. So I think there is an onus on all of us here to actually think hard about what we can do that is more than just changing the light bulb. Not that that's not a good thing to do it, but that can deliver scaled, leveraged effects and have the social impact in a measurable way on this issue. So that's the first point, leadership. The second one relates to it, and it's about relationships. We're here not to have a normal conference. It hasn't been normal so far, and it'll get less normal tomorrow. We're here to have a workshop, to discuss ideas, to challenge each other, and to deliver some action. This is not supposed to be a talking shop. It's supposed to be a launching pad for a network of us acting in this space together and doing much more than we can as individuals. And I think one of the things that Bill just said, which I enjoyed, is that the thing about being an individual is that I can't exactly remember the words, but you want to stop being an individual and being a network of people working together. And so we've had a lot of space for engagement today, but the spaces don't end now. We've got drinks, dinner, pub, and I would encourage you not just to come to those, but even if you've got a hangover, and certainly I'll be knackered whether I drink anything or not, come tomorrow as well for the morning run or walk and engage there. meet people, introduce yourselves, talk about what you're doing, learn from each other, and be prepared, as Forbes said earlier, to ask for help. It's a great book by Adam Grant, Give and Take. Probably many of you have read it. The winners in life are those who give. And one of the things about the givers is that they also ask for help more than matchers and takers. So don't hesitate to ask for help and to give it as well, especially within this space. Now, the third thing I wanted to effectively finish on is to be forward-looking. This is a challenge for the world. It's a challenge of the present, but it affects many, many future generations. And that takes me to what is next, the very near future. We've got an exciting day of leaders with us tomorrow. I'm not going to necessarily call them speakers because we're here to engage. Mohammed Nasheed, Dan Esty, Varun Siratham, and a panel to discuss things. But we want to not just have a dialogue with our external invited guests and experts, and some of them aren't guests, they're intrinsic to this community. But to really, really get into the meat of these discussions. So if you haven't already spoken today, put your hand up. And if you have a look around and see if there's someone who hasn't put, and I'm in this category, I should shut up. But make sure that other people are speaking and that we're getting a full diversity of views. Any of you who have managed a team before will know, I hope, that psychological safety is one of the most key determinants of team function, and correlated with psychological safety is a wide diversity of views being expressed in a team. And I'd really like to make sure that we get that happening tomorrow. And with that, so that's my 3 points: leadership, relationships, and thinking ahead. We're not done yet, but I would like to just acknowledge, as I said right at the start of the day, that I'm a mere figurehead here. There's some extremely talented individuals in this room who I think are worthy of our interim thanks. I know we're not done yet, but I'd just like to acknowledge Rebecca. There's a dozen of them: Rebecca, Sai, Hamish, Tom, Zara, David, Jade, Jesse, Jimmy, Colin, Avon, and Bernard. So well done, guys. You've done a fantastic job.